The foundational geography of North American defense, a map that the Pentagon has treated as an immutable law of nature for over 80 years, has just fundamentally fractured. For the better part of a century, the United States military operated under the assumption that its northern border was merely a symbolic administrative line. When the Department of Defense required the movement of heavy armor, personnel, or advanced missile components to the strategic frontier of Alaska, they utilized the Canadian land bridge with absolute, unquestioned confidence. That guarantee was violently rescinded this morning. In a development that has transformed a bitter trade war into a full-scale continental security crisis, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken the historically unprecedented step of denying transit clearance for a series of high-priority U.S. military logistics convoys. As of this hour, miles of heavy transport vehicles, reportedly laden with critical Arctic defense infrastructure and munitions, are physically immobilized at border crossings from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains. The integrated defense grid of the Western Hemisphere is, for the first time since the 1940s, physically obstructed by its closest ally. The reaction from the White House has been one of unmitigated fury. President Trump reportedly views this not as a mere extension of the ongoing 25% universal tariff dispute, but as a direct act of sabotage against American national security. The administration had gambled on the belief that no matter how hostile the economic rhetoric became, Ottawa would treat the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and Joint Military Logistics as sacred ground. They were wrong. Prime Minister Carney has explicitly weaponized Canada's geography, sending a chilling ultimatum to the Oval Office. If Washington intends to suffocate the Canadian economy with punitive trade measures, the U.S. military will no longer enjoy the sovereign privilege of Canadian territory. This is no longer a debate over the cost of softwood lumber or aluminum. This is a logistical hostage situation that severs the primary overland artery the Pentagon relies on to supply its northernmost outposts, facilities that are essential for monitoring Russian and Chinese strategic maneuvers in the Arctic. By dropping the boom gates, Canada has exposed a glaring foundational vulnerability in the American defense posture. The unified shield is fracturing in real time, and adversarial capitals in Moscow and Beijing are witnessing a historic American weakness suddenly laid bare. To understand the breathtaking audacity of this maneuver, one must look back to 1942. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military identified a catastrophic vulnerability: the vast, unprotected northern flank of Alaska. To secure the continent, American engineers and Canadian authorities jointly forged the Alaska Highway, ALCAN, a 1,500-mile logistical miracle carved through the wilderness of British Columbia and the Yukon. For 8 decades, that highway has functioned as the unbreakable spine of continental security. It was the physical manifestation of the special relationship, a geographic promise that when it came to the defense of the homeland, the border effectively did not exist. That historical certainty began to erode the moment the White House adopted a purely transactional, zero-sum view of its Northern alliance. The timeline of the collapse. T-6 months. Washington imposes a 25% universal baseline tariff on Canadian imports. T-3 months. PM. Carney warns that Canadians' sovereign cooperation is tied to economic respect. T-30 days. The Pentagon notifies Ottawa of a routine logistical surge bound for Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. T-14 days. Canadian diplomats quietly suggest that transit security cannot be guaranteed under current financial constraints. This morning, convoys reach the border and are physically denied entry. The scene at the border this morning was as chilling as it was surreal. At 0300 hours, the lead elements of 2 massive U.S. military convoys approached the crossings at Blaine, Washington, and Sweetgrass, Montana. Under standard operating procedure, the transport commanders would present their manifests, receive a perfunctory clearance, and begin the trek north. Today, the gates remained down. Canadian Border Services Agency officers, supported by specialized tactical units of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, approached the American vehicles not with weapons drawn, but with formal notices of denial. The manifests were rejected. The convoys were ordered to turn around and park on American soil. Within minutes, the asphalt of Montana became the front line of a geopolitical earthquake. Canada is not declaring a military blockade. They are declaring an administrative impossibility. It is a brilliant, cynical use of the bureaucratic machine as a weapon of war. Anonymous senior defense analyst. The competing narratives emerging from this crisis are fundamentally irreconcilable. The Pentagon and the White House are characterizing this as a hostile act of extortion. They argue that by blocking radar arrays and interceptor components, Canada is actively sabotaging the defense of North America and violating NATO transit protocols. However, the Carney government has deployed a legally airtight, brilliantly frustrating defense. They are not calling this a blockade. Instead, they are citing a lack of sovereign capacity. Ottawa's argument is that because the 25% tariffs have decimated the Canadian federal budget, the government simply no longer has the resources, personnel, or financial overhead required to safely monitor and escort thousands of tons of foreign military hardware across its territory. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic sabotage, using the U.S. administration's own economic weapons as the justification for a military no-fly zone on the ground. To understand why the Pentagon is in a state of high-level panic, one must look at the brutal math of Arctic logistics. While Alaska is part of the continent, from a military supply perspective, it is effectively an island. Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and the mid-course interceptors at Fort Greely require a constant, heavy-volume flow of equipment that the Air Force simply cannot sustain via C-17 transport planes alone. Sea routes through the Gulf of Alaska are slow, expensive, and leave critical hardware exposed to adversarial monitoring in the Pacific. The Alaska Highway was the only secure, high-volume overland artery. Without it, the Pentagon is essentially trying to supply a nuclear-armed island fortress through a straw. According to internal memos circulating within the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, this blockade is being categorized as a catastrophic intelligence failure. Washington's threat models assumed Canada would retaliate against tariffs by taxing dairy, steel, or automotive parts. The U.S. intelligence apparatus was completely blind to the possibility that Ottawa would touch the third rail of North American security. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSYS, are warning that this marks a definitive Monroe Doctrine collapse. For generations, the foundational premise of American statecraft was that North America was a unified security perimeter. By successfully barricading U.S. military assets, Canada has provided a blueprint for other allies. American military access is no longer a blank check. It is a commodity that can be revoked if the economic price becomes too high. However, to view this purely as a triumphant move by Ottawa is to ignore the cold reality of hard power. Many veteran strategists argue that Carney may have committed a fatal act of overreach. 1. Political theater. Skeptics argue that this blockade is a calculated piece of domestic political theater. By standing up to a blustering American president, Carney is attempting to unite a panicked Canadian public and neutralize his political opposition at home as the economy slides into a tariff-induced recession. 2. U.S. escalation. By touching the absolute third rail of American national security, Canada has handed the White House the ultimate justification for a total escalation. U.S. hawks are already arguing that if Canada behaves like a hostile transit state, it should be treated like one. 3. The dollar weapon. If the Trump administration responds by weaponizing the U.S. dollar against the Canadian banking sector or invoking national emergency powers to seal the commercial border entirely, Ottawa's geographic leverage could evaporate overnight. The boom gates in Blaine and Sweetgrass have done more than stop a few trucks. They have signaled the end of the North American fortress. Mark Carney has demonstrated that in a 21st century conflict, geography is a weapon that can be wielded by the small against the large. The Pentagon is now faced with a terrifying new reality. The United States is geographically dependent on a nation it is currently trying to economically dismantle. As the convoys idle on the interstate and the diplomatic cables fly between Ottawa and D.C., one thing is clear: the unified shield has been cracked, and the cost of repairing it may be higher than anyone in Washington is currently willing to pay.